I'm Claire Ridgway. I'm founder of the Anne Boleyn Files website and also author of several books on Anne Boleyn and the Boleyn family, including co-authoring this book on George Boleyn and my book on Anne Boleyn's fall, The Fall of Anne Boleyn, A Countdown. Now, in this series of videos, questions about Anne Boleyn, I'm actually answering questions that Anne Boleyn Files followers put forward a few months ago, especially for this video series. I've answered quite a few already, and you can see those in the playlist. But today I wanted to look at the question, was Anne Boleyn a homewrecker? Now, by the way, I apologise for the noise that's going on. It's a very blustery day out there. It's very atmospheric. So I've got leaves blowing on the roof and all kinds of atmospheric sounds in the background. Now, Anne Boleyn may have been successfully rehabilitated in many ways, especially through the work of Eric Ives, for example, in the 1980s, 90s and early 2000s with his biography of Anne. The majority of historians today believe that Anne was innocent of all the charges laid against her in May 1536, that she was framed, that she went to her death on the 19th of May 1536 as an innocent woman. But we still have all kinds of accusations and name-calling aimed at her. Her relationship with King Henry VIII, who was, of course, a married man. He was married to Queen Catherine of Aragon when he started his relationship with Anne. So that has led to her being accused of being a homewrecker, a whore, a manipulator, a sexual predator, a slut, and all kinds of really vile names, words, and accusations. And I see them not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. I think this has come from fiction and TV and movies. Fiction and TV often depict Anne as a woman who set her eyes on the crown, who wasn't content with being like her sister Mary Boleyn or Elizabeth Blunt, Bessie Blunt, as being a king's mistress, that she'd set her eyes on the crown, that she wanted to be queen, that she was a woman whose ambition knew no bounds, that she was this social climber who wasn't content with her lot in life. She wasn't going to be cast off like her sister before her. She was going to get everything. And how does this fictional Anne do that? Well, she does. She plays a game. She dangles her virginity in front of the king like bait. This is a lustful king. She baits him, and then she slowly and carefully reels him in. She manipulates him. She turns him against his wife of, 20 odd years, Catherine of Aragon. She turns him against his own daughter. She makes him completely consumed with lust for her. He'll do anything to have her, and he finally offers her what she's planned all along, what she wants, and that is marriage and, of course, the crown of Queen Consort. Now, even if this fictional Anne isn't fully in control of her destiny, even if she's portrayed as being a pawn of her family, usually Thomas Boleyn and the Duke of Norfolk are depicted as, pimps, really. And I'll give you a link to my video on Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn so you can find out more about Thomas Boleyn. So even if she isn't fully in control and is more of a pawn, she's still kind of coached in how to appeal to him. She still traps him. She holds him in some kind of sexual stranglehold. She'll let him go so far, but not all the way. And it's all for ambition and power, whether it's her own ambition and power or whether it's that of the Boleyn family. Now, I could sigh and do a face palm and bang my head on my table here, because there is so much wrong with that depiction of Anne that it's hard to know where to begin. And I apologise if this video is more of a ramble through my thoughts rather than, a posh academic presentation. But I just want to share sort of my views and how I come at this. There are two main problems, in my view, that I see with this idea of Anne. One, by painting her as this homewrecker and this game player, we are judging Anne with our hindsight that Anne never had. We know that the Anne that the king started wooing in the 1520s would become queen in 1533. So we're judging her actions in the 1520s and her relationship with King Henry VIII based on our hindsight, based on what we know happened, that she became queen. The second problem is that we're also judging Anne, King Henry VIII, and the people and the events of this time with our 21st century eyes and our views and our morals, our ideals, and the way that we think. We're not taking into account the role of women in the 16th century, the ideas regarding monarchy and the king's position and power, and also the context in which these people were living. So those are my two main problems with this idea of Anne as being the powerful one, as being the homewrecker. Now, we don't know the ins and outs of King Henry's relationship with Anne Boleyn, and that is very, very frustrating. What we do know is that Anne was recalled from serving Queen Claude of France, that's the consort of King Francis I, in late 1521. She was recalled so that she could return to England to serve Queen Catherine of Aragon as a maid of honour, and also because there were negotiations ongoing, very, very atmospheric, negotiations ongoing for Anne to marry James Butler of Ormond in Ireland. Obviously negotiations that eventually fizzled out. Anne's first recorded debut at the English court was when she played Perseverance at the Chateau Vert pageant at Shrovetide in March 1522. But she doesn't become linked to the king until quite a bit later, until at least 1524. That's the earliest that she becomes linked to the king by historians. Some, including Eric Ives, don't link her to the king until 1526 or so. And this was following her relationship with Henry Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland, a relationship that was broken up by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey because they were both, Anne and Percy were both due to marry other people. And there is some evidence that the king might also have put a stop to it because he may have been interested in Anne. We don't know the truth of that. But sometime after her relationship with Percy in around 1523, 1524, and before the summer of 1527, when King Henry VIII applied for a dispensation to marry Anne, we know that Henry began wooing Anne, that he fell for her. Unfortunately, we know very little of this early courtship. Obviously, after the dispensation, and then with Henry's quest for an annulment and him being publicly involved with Anne, we get a lot more detail. But the early stages of their courtship is a bit of a mystery. We do have some letters. They're in the Vatican archives. It is believed that a papal agent stole these letters written by Henry to Anne Boleyn as evidence to show that Henry didn't just want to annul his marriage to Catherine because of his scruples, his conscience, but because he was involved with another woman. So we have those love letters, but we don't have Anne's replies to them. And so our view of their relationship, their courtship at this time, is very one-sided, very limited. Obviously, we can ascertain certain things by sort of reading between the lines, looking at what Henry's saying in his letters, which are obviously in response to what Anne has said at points. So there are various things we can glean from his letters. We know, for example, from these letters that Anne had refused to become the king's mistress, that she'd refused to sleep with him, that she'd retreated to the family home of Hever Castle to get away from the king and from the court. She even refused to be his official mistress, which was a position like that of the French official mistress, where you actually were publicly acknowledged as the king's mistress in quite a high status position. And we know that she didn't respond to some of Henry VIII's letters, that her radio silence caused the king to worry, to believe that he'd offended her, to apologise to her, and to act out a sort of panic, really, that, Anne wasn't responding to him. He wasn't receiving replies to her. She was refusing to go back to court. She wasn't acting in the way that he expected or that he wanted. Now, this was all part of the game, people might say. She was playing hard to get. She was reeling him in. He was going for that trap that she'd laid. All this was part of a game. Oh, but that is so ridiculous in so many ways. How could Anne know that by refusing to sleep with King Henry VIII, that by retreating to Hever Castle and getting away from court and protecting her virtue, how could she know that any of that would lead to the king proposing marriage to her? Wouldn't it have been more likely for the relationship to have just fizzled out at this point, to have ended? Henry was King of England, and he was a good-looking and charming man. There were women that would have said yes to his advances. He'd had mistresses before. There would have been women that were willing to be a king's mistress. Surely it would have been more likely for, if Anne said no to him, she wasn't answering him, she'd gone away from court, surely it would have been more likely for the king to have moved on to an easier conquest, to have given up on Anne, rather than carrying on chasing a woman who appeared not to have wanted to have been caught. As Eric Hayes points out in his wonderful biography of Anne Boleyn, only one thing can explain Henry's subsequent actions. Only one thing can explain why Henry didn't stop pursuing Anne at this point. And this is the king's realisation that he was completely in love with Anne and could not live without her. And there is no way that Anne could have predicted that the king would feel that way and that he would subsequently do everything in his power to have her. There was just no way she could know that. There was no precedent. Bessie Blunt, a previous mistress of King Henry VIII, had given the king a longed-for son, Henry Fitzroy. It may have been an illegitimate son, but she'd given him that prize that Catherine of Aragon had failed to give him. And yet she hadn't been offered marriage, had she? Mary Boleyn had been his mistress, and she hadn't got close to marriage. How could Anne have predicted that the king would fall for her so much that he would offer her marriage? How could she have known that by saying no to him, that he would come back with a marriage proposal. And then with some people, it's a case of Anne being damned if she did and damned if she didn't, by refusing to sleep with the king, by holding on to her virtue, for marriage. She's seen as a manipulator, a game player, as someone that was using her sexuality. And then when she finally does give in to the king, when she says yes to him, she becomes a homewrecker. And worse, I won't repeat some of the words that I see, being used against Anne. So, yeah, she's just a baddie either way to some people. And what about the home wrecking bit? Was she a home wrecker? Did she actually wreck that home? Did she destroy Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon? Well, I suppose you'd have to say yes to that, in that Henry's love for Anne, his obsession with her, did lead to him finally annulling his marriage to Catherine, to, banishing her and not having anything to do with her. But, and I don't want to be seen as condoning extramarital affairs in any way, because I certainly don't. And it's hard to say this without sounding as if I'm using it as a big excuse, but Henry does appear, by the point before he met Anne, to have reached the point where he believed that his marriage was over. And in fact, more than that his marriage was never a marriage in the first place, that it was never valid. Catherine's last pregnancy had been in 1518, and it had resulted in the birth of a stillborn daughter. She'd been pregnant at least 6 times, and over those years had only managed to give the king a son who lived just 52 days, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, and a healthy daughter, Mary, who Henry felt was of no use. Catherine didn't see the problem with a woman ruling, but Henry did. So for Henry's point of view was that his marriage, it was a failure. Catherine was a failure. Not very fair, but that's how Henry saw it. And Eric Ives believes that Henry ceased sleeping with Catherine around 1524, and that it was rumoured that he may even have been considering setting her aside, divorcing her as early as 1522, so before Anne came on the scene. By 1525, when he raised his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy to be Duke of Richmond, he appears to have completely given up on Catherine and was kind of building up Fitzroy as an alternative heir to Mary, who he did not consider could be, his heir, could become queen. Then Anne happened and gave him hope for the future. Now, I'm not excusing Henry's treatment of Catherine at all, and I'm not saying that, because, he said his marriage was over, that it was fine what he did to Catherine. I'm not saying that at all. It is easy to see his scruples, his troubled conscience over his first marriage and the validity of his first marriage, and the fact that this idea that he'd committed incest by marrying his brother's widow, as just a convenient excuse that Henry used to put Catherine to one side and to marry the woman he was besotted with, to move on. But it does actually appear that Henry VIII truly viewed Catherine's reproductive woes, her 6 pregnancies, her failure to give him a Prince of Wales, a living Prince of Wales, as proof that their union was against God's law, that God hadn't blessed them with a living son and heir because there was something wrong with the marriage. He therefore viewed the marriage as invalid, and so felt that he could take Anne as his wife because that would be valid, that surely would be blessed by God. And in viewing all this, we need to understand how Tudor people felt, how things were seen as portents, as omens, as signs. Here Henry was seeing those dead babies, those stillbirths, the loss of Henry, Duke of Cornwall. All that was signs from God that he needed to understand, that he needed to read into. There surely had to be something wrong, otherwise God would have blessed him. But what about Anne in all of this? Even if we sort of excuse Henry there, how could she betray the woman who was her mistress? She was maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon. How could she betray her mistress, her queen, and become involved with that woman's husband, with Henry VIII? Well, I think when we paint Anne, well, I don't paint her this way, but when some people paint Anne as this scarlet woman and this homewrecker, we are conveniently forgetting Anne's status, her position in society, and the position of the king. Anne was a maid of honour. She was a servant. And not only that, she was a woman. Now, a woman in those days really expected to have her life, her destiny mapped out by the men around her, by her father, by her uncles, by the men of her family. A young woman didn't expect much say in her destiny, in her life's plan. And here was the King of England, who was God's anointed sovereign, someone that Anne would have believed had been chosen by God to rule the country that she lived in, to rule the people, to rule her. Here was this man not only wooing her, paying her some lovely attention, but telling her in no uncertain terms that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid, that it was contrary to God's law, and then choosing Anne as his wife. Plus, those close to the king, his advisors, were all backing up what he said. And churchmen and canon lawyers, people that knew the Bible and could understand the Bible and its laws, were agreeing with him. What was Anne meant to think if all of these people were implying that, Henry VIII was never married to Catherine of Aragon anyway? Now, there is absolutely no evidence that Anne reciprocated the king's feelings at first. That they both fell in love at the same time. It was love at first sight. And we know that she definitely rebuffed him at first, that she refused his advances. It's hard to know when, or even if, she fell in love with the king, but she probably believed that it was her destiny, that it was God's plan for her to marry him and to become queen. I don't see Anne as feeling that that it was her destiny to bring about the Protestant Reformation or anything quite as deep as that. But I think that she probably did feel that it was God's plan for her, that it was her destiny, and that's why the king had chosen her. We have Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, in the 1540s, putting aside her love for Thomas Seymour. She'd recently been widowed. She was in love with Thomas Seymour. He was in love with her. They wanted to marry. But then along came King Henry VIII, and he proposed to her. And she set aside her love for Thomas Seymour to accept the king's proposal because she believed it was what God wanted for her, that it was her destiny. Then, fast forward to 1553, we have Lady Jane Grey. Now, she didn't want the crown. She accepted the crown and everything that came with it because Edward VI had chosen her as his successor. She believed that by the king choosing her, that was proof that it was God's plan for her, that it was her destiny to be Queen of England, and so she went for it. And I believe that Anne thought that her destiny was in God's hands, that this was what God wanted for her, and that also her destiny was in the king's hands as God's anointed sovereign, and that if the king wanted to marry her, then so be it. My own personal opinion is that Anne did fall in love with the king. He was, at this point, a very charming man, a very witty man, intelligent, athletic, very generous, very handsome. They shared many interests. I think it was a meeting of minds in many ways. I think they were very similar in many ways. And to have been wooed by this man must have been such a wonderful, kind of heady thing. It must have been amazing. But that's sort of straying from the topic of this talk. And I'll give you a link to my video about whether Henry VIII really loved Anne Boleyn, because that goes into that side of the relationship a bit more. Another problem I have with the Homewrecker label for Anne is that it's putting the blame for everything squarely on Anne's shoulders. I really thought that we'd moved on a bit with our attitudes to women, but some people just like to be misogynistic, don't they? Why should Anne get all of the blame? Why is she a homewrecker, and yet Henry doesn't seem to bear any responsibility in some people's views? Shouldn't Henry VIII, as the married man in this situation, take blame? He was the one abandoning his wife of 20-odd years and wooing another woman. He was the one that had already had affairs and who even had an illegitimate son. But he's a man. This is how some people think. He couldn't help himself. He's not in control. It's not his fault that he was manipulated, that he fell into this honey trap, into Anne's sexual stranglehold. Oh, that's so bizarre. Please, can we stop always blaming the other women in these types of situations? Henry was the man, and in those days, and still in some situations today, that was the position of power. Anne was in a very submissive position, as was Catherine of Aragon. He was the one with all of the power, plus he was king too. He was king of England. He was Anne Boleyn's employer at the end of the day. He was the employer of her family as well. She was in a very vulnerable position. She didn't have power. She used the only power that she had to say no to him, to rebuff him. Then another point I'd like to make is the point regarding Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn is somehow this homewrecker, this home-wrecking whore, while Jane Seymour is, in many people's view, a meek, mild, virtuous woman, who wouldn't say boo to a goose and who's got no bad side at all. Now, Anne rebuffed the king's advances. She said no to becoming his mistress, with no precedent for her to believe that saying no to him so many times and removing herself from court would actually increase his desire, his ardour, and lead to a marriage proposal. And yet, with her doing all that, she's somehow seen as this game player, this master manipulator. Yet Jane, who we know did play a part in Anne Boleyn's fall in 1536, a woman who did whisper horrible things in the king's ear about Anne, who told the king of, how unpopular Anne was with, his people, who had Anne's example to copy, who was coached by her brothers and the likes of Sir Nicholas Carew in how to behave with the king to sort of draw him in, is somehow not a homewrecker, and that doesn't seem fair. Now, I'm not trying to demonise Jane Seymour here at all. We know from Eustace Shaftesbury, the imperial ambassador, that Jane was being used as a pawn, that she was being told what to do by this faction at court, by her brothers, by Carew, by others who were on sort of Mary's side, and that wanted, to get rid of Anne, or to at least bring her influence on the king down. And of course, Jane could have had absolutely no idea that her actions would lead to the brutal deaths of Anne and various men at court. I'm not trying to demonise Jane, but what I'm pointing out is how unfair it is to paint Anne as a homewrecker, as this scarlet woman, to throw all these names at Anne when Anne had no way of knowing that her actions could lead to her being queen, and yet somehow seeing Jane as being just a complete angel when Jane could know that her actions could lead to her becoming queen. It just seems very unfair. Now, I'm not trying to put Anne on a pedestal. I'm not trying to make her into a saint. I'm not trying to make her look perfect. Or a complete victim of circumstances. I just don't believe that Anne Boleyn set out to wreck Catherine of Aragon's marriage. I don't believe that she set out to take her place and become queen. I do believe when it was finally offered to her, and when she'd fallen in love with the king, and when she'd been persuaded that Henry VIII's marriage wasn't valid, I do believe at that point that she came to believe that it was her destiny, that it was God's plan for her, and that at that point she was willing to fight tooth and nail for her destiny, to support the king in his quest for the annulment, his great matter as it came to be called. I just don't believe that she decided one day as a lowly maid of honour that she would become queen at any cost. I don't believe she set out to wreck Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and I feel it is completely unfair to paint her as this homewrecker. So I'm sorry if that was a little bit ranty or rambly, but I just wanted to share some of my views about why I feel it is so unfair to use these labels against Anne Boleyn. You might feel differently, and I love debates and I love to hear people's points of view. So please do share your comments, your points of view in comments below this video. I would really love to know your thoughts and whether you think there's something that I've missed out as well as an argument for or against. So please do share your views. I always enjoy talking Tudor. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. There'll be more videos coming in this series, but do check out the rest of the playlist and also the rest of my channel as well. There's lots of Tudor goodies. You can subscribe by just clicking on the button there, and you can hit the bell to be notified of future videos as well. You can of course like this video and I do hope you enjoyed it. I will see you again soon. Take care. Bye bye.